Before there was light, there was a heartbeat, slow, passion. A deep green rhythm pulsing through a darkness that had no stars, no planets, no name. It was not outer space. It was not another world. It was something deeper, the black silence that exists between realities, where fragments of a broken universe drifted like ash from a fire no one remembered lighting. Universes are not meant to touch. They turn beside one another like enormous wheels, each sealed inside its own laws, its own time, its own fate. But sometimes, something powerful enough can force them together. And when two universes collide, something always falls through. Above an ordinary Earth, on an ordinary evening, the sky tore open. It did not open with thunder. It opened with a sound like the world inhaling, a wound of white and green light splitting the clouds apart. People in the streets below stopped and looked up. Some raised their phones, some ran. And then something came through the wound, something massive, falling like a meteor wrapped in fire. It struck the outskirts of the city with the force of a bomb. The shockwave flattened a warehouse, shattered windows for a mile in every direction, and threw cars through the air like toys. A crater smoked where a parking lot had been. For a long moment there was only dust and sirens and the ringing silence that follows catastrophe. Then the dust moved. A hand rose from the crater, enormous, green. The fingers closed against the scorched earth, and slowly, impossibly, a figure pulled itself upright, taller than any man, built like a siege engine given flesh. It stood among the fires it had made and breathed the air of a world it did not know. This was the Hulk. But not a Hulk this world had ever rumored or imagined. This one was older, harder. Its eyes burned with an intelligence that had nothing gentle in it. It looked at the ruined street, at the fleeing crowds, at the strange skyline, and its confusion curdled into something else, rage. The military arrived within minutes. Helicopters circled. Soldiers formed lines behind armored vehicles, and a voice over a loudspeaker commanded the creature to stand down. The Hulk did not understand the words. He only understood what he had always understood. Weapons pointed at him. Fear pointed at him. The same story wearing a new sky. They opened fire. Missiles struck his chest and burst into flowers of flame. Rounds hammered against his skin and fell away like rain. The Hulk walked through it the way a man walks through a storm, and when a tank shell knocked him off his feet, he rose again before the smoke cleared, untouched, unimpressed and angry. The soldiers broke. They ran, and no one who watched the footage later could blame them. The Hulk roared. The sound rolled across the city like a wave, rattling windows miles away. A sound that did not belong to anything that should exist. In a darkened facility across the country, Cecil Stedman watched the live feed in silence. He had seen superhumans level city blocks. He had seen Viltrumites tear through armies. But he had never seen anything survive an impact like the one that carved that crater, let alone stand up afterward and ask, in its own wordless way, for more. This was not a superhero. This was not a villain. This was a question wearing the shape of a monster. Cecil ordered the Guardians of the Globe to mobilize. Whatever had come through that tear in the sky, he wanted it found, contained, and understood, in that order if possible, in any order if necessary. But by the time the Guardians reached the impact site, the crater was empty. The green giant had vanished into the wilderness beyond the city, leaving behind only wreckage, footprints pressed inches deep into asphalt, and 100 witnesses telling the same impossible story. That night, Cecil stood alone in the dark, studying the footage frame by frame. The fall, the fire, the impact that should have reduced anything living to vapor, and then the hand rising out of the dust. One question filled his mind and refused to leave. What exactly had just come through that portal? And beneath that question, a colder one was already forming. If the creature could survive that, could it be killed at all? Somewhere far away, in the dark between the mountains, something enormous moved through the forest, and the night itself seemed to step back and let it pass. The wilderness swallowed him. For days, the Hulk wandered through forests and over mountains, crossing a world that made no sense to him. The trees were wrong. The stars were wrong. The smell of the air was wrong. In his own universe, there had been voices, enemies he understood, a fragile map of places and faces that meant something. Here, there was nothing. No Avengers, no familiar cities, no Bruce Banner waking in the quiet to explain where they were and what had happened. There was only the Hulk, alone under an alien moon, carrying an anger that had nowhere to go. He was not simply furious. That would have been easier. He was lost. He drank from rivers. He slept in caves. He stood on ridgelines at dawn and studied the distant cities with eyes that missed nothing, trying to decide whether this world was a threat, a trap, or just another place that would learn to fear him. The answer, he suspected, was already written. Every world learned to fear him. It was only ever a matter of time. The guardians of the globe found him in a high valley, standing in a river with the water foaming white around his legs. They came in carefully. They had seen the footage. They had read Cecil's brief, which contained more questions than answers. The team spread out across the valley floor, and their leader raised empty hands and spoke in a calm voice. The way you speak to a cornered animal, you do not want to become a catastrophe. The Hulk regarded them in silence. He did not attack. That, in itself, was something. For several long minutes, the two sides simply existed in the same space. The Guardians tried words. The Hulk offered nothing but a low, continuous rumble, a warning as old as instinct. Stay back. Leave me alone. Then it happened. A flicker of movement, a burst of energy meant to contain rather than harm, a miscalculation by a hero who had never fought anything like this. The blast struck the Hulk across the shoulder. It did not wound him. It did something worse. It reminded him. The valley exploded. The fight that followed was unlike anything the Guardians had ever trained for. They came at him with everything. Speed that blurred the air, bolts of energy that split boulders, telekinetic force that tore trees from the earth and hurled them like spears. Raw strength, thrown at him in coordinated waves, the kind of teamwork that had ended wars. And for a while, it worked. The Hulk was buried under stone. He was driven to his knees. He was struck from 3 directions at once by powers moving faster than he could follow. Any other creature on Earth would have fallen. The Hulk got up. That was the moment the Guardians began to understand. Pain did not weaken this thing. Pain fed it. Every blow they landed came back to them doubled, because the angrier he grew, the stronger he became, and there did not seem to be a ceiling. His fists cratered the valley floor. His roar shattered the calm of the mountains. When one of the strongest among them closed in for a finishing strike, the Hulk caught him in one enormous hand and threw him across the battlefield like a stone skipping over water. They were not fighting a man. They were fighting a law of physics that had learned to hate. In his facility, Cecil watched the drone feeds with his jaw tight and his finger hovering over the order he did not want to give. Then he gave a different one. Stand down. Pull back. Now. The Guardians withdrew, battered and disbelieving, and the valley fell silent again. The Hulk stood alone among the ruin, chest heaving, fists clenched, waiting for the next attack. It did not come. Instead, something else arrived. Not a sound, not a sight, a smell. The Hulk's senses were sharper than any weapon in Cecil's arsenal, and they caught something on the wind, something faint and far away. Fear. Not the fear of the Guardians, which was ordinary and honest. This was different. This was the fear of prey that has just realized what shares its world, and woven through it, beneath it, was a presence, something vast and calm and utterly without mercy moving through the sky far beyond the horizon. It felt familiar, not because the Hulk had ever met it, but because he recognized what it was. The thing at the top of the food chain, looking down at everything beneath it. For the first time since falling through the wound in the sky, the Hulk's anger faltered. His eyes turned toward the horizon. His expression changed in a way no footage had ever captured. He was not enraged. He was afraid. Something in this world had noticed his arrival, and it was not Cecil. It was not the Guardians. It was something far older in its cruelty, something that flew toward him now at a speed no eye could track, carrying the quiet confidence of a predator that has never once failed a hunt. News travels fast in a world accustomed to monsters. Within days, the story of the Green Giant reached the one man on Earth whose opinion actually mattered. Nolan Grayson heard it the way he heard everything, with the polite indifference of a being who had lived for thousands of years and conquered worlds before breakfast. Earth produced strange superhumans the way a garden produces weeds. He had seen beings of living energy, immortals, creatures stitched together from science and madness. None of it impressed him anymore. Then Cecil told him the part that did. The creature had survived an uncontrolled fall through a dimensional rupture and an impact that registered like a tactical warhead. It had taken everything the Guardians of the Globe could deliver and grown stronger. Its biology did not behave like biology. There was no measurable upper limit to what it could endure or become. Nolan decided to see for himself. He found the Hulk in a remote valley, standing among the ruins of the Guardians' defeat. The green giant sensed him before he landed, the way prey senses weather changing. The Hulk turned. The two most dangerous beings on this earth regarded each other across a field of broken stone. There was no introduction, no warning. Nolan did not believe in either. He struck at full speed, and the impact sent the Hulk through a mountainside. The far slope of the peak collapsed in a landslide of shattered granite. Dust climbed into the sky like a signal fire. Nolan hovered above the wreckage and waited, arms folded, already composing the brief report he would give Cecil. Then, beneath 1,000 tons of rock, something moved. Fingers, then a fist. Then the entire mountain seemed to shrug, and the Hulk rose out of the rubble with stone dust pouring off his shoulders like water. He looked up at the floating man, and he smiled. It was not a friendly expression. Nolan's confidence shifted for the first time. The second fight was a spectacle that would be studied in classified rooms for years. Viltrumite speed against Hulk's raw, escalating power. Nolan attacked from every direction at once, a red and white blur striking with force enough to crack tectonic plates. The Hulk swung and missed, his fists demolishing landscape instead of target. Any observer would have called it a massacre in slow motion, but every blow Nolan landed had a cost. Each impact fed the fire. The Hulk's eyes burned brighter, his muscles swelled, his swings came faster, and the air itself began to scream around them. He was not learning to fight, he was learning to hunt. Then he caught him. One hand closed around Nolan's wrist mid-strike, and the world stopped for a heartbeat. The punch that followed sent Omni-Man through 3 miles of sky and into the side of a cliff. What came next had no elegance to it at all. The two of them tore upward through the atmosphere, trading blows that lit the clouds from within, into the black edge of space where the cold meant nothing to either of them, and then back down, falling together like a burning star, and the impact of their landing changed the shape of the valley forever. Nolan rose from the crater with blood on his face, his own, and something unfamiliar in his chest. He had fought monsters on 100 worlds. He had broken champions, tyrants, living gods. But those fights had a rhythm. You hurt the enemy weakened, the enemy fell. This one had no rhythm. Every death blow he delivered was answered by a stronger creature than the one he had struck. The Hulk was not fighting with intelligence. He was adapting with instinct, and instinct did not know how to lose, so Nolan stopped holding back. What followed was not a fight. It was an execution. Viltrumite strength honed over millennia of conquest, unleashed without restraint or mercy. When it was over, the Hulk lay still in a grave of molten stone, and the silence that followed was so complete that Nolan could hear his own breathing. He looked at the body for a long moment. Then he turned away. The heartbeat reached him first. Low, slow, patient as stone. Boom. Nolan stopped walking. Boom. Behind him, the green giant rose, not limping, not weakened, not carrying a single wound from the battle that had killed him. He rose whole and vast and angrier than anything Nolan had ever stood against, and the look in his eyes was not defeat or even hatred. It was recognition. You tried. It was not enough. It will never be enough. Nolan Grayson had conquered worlds. He had never once known fear as anything other than a word other species used. Standing in that ruined valley, watching the creature rise from death as casually as a man rises from sleep, he finally understood the word from the inside. This was the horror at the center of it all. He had fought monsters before. He had never fought one that grew stronger every time death failed to stop it. He withdrew, not en route, but in retreat, and there was no shame in it, because shame requires an audience that understands what you faced, and nothing alive understood what he had faced. He brought Cecil a warning instead of a victory. The creature could be hurt. It could even be killed for a while, but it came back, and it came back worse. Whatever it was not something that could be punched into obedience. Cecil absorbed this in silence and asked the question Nolan had been avoiding. If Omni-Man could not permanently stop the Hulk, what would happen when the rest of the Viltrumite Empire learned he existed? Nolan did not answer, because the answer was already moving through the dark between stars, and it was not coming to negotiate. Mark Grayson found him by accident, which is to say he found him the way everyone in this world eventually found the Hulk, by following the destruction. A settlement near the mountains had been evacuated after tremors, and Mark had flown in to check for stragglers. Instead, he found the green giant sitting at the edge of a dry riverbed, motionless, staring at nothing, surrounded by the crushed remains of trees he had clearly pushed aside rather than simply walked through. It was a small thing, a strange thing. The creature from the footage was a landslide with fists. This creature was being careful. Mark landed at a distance. He did not raise his fists. He had grown up with the strongest being on Earth as a father, and one thing he had learned young was that you could tell a great deal about power by how it behaved when no one was making it angry. The Hulk ignored him, so Mark talked. He introduced himself. He said he was not there to fight. He said the evacuation had gone well and no one had been hurt. And he watched the giant's shoulders shift slightly at that, as if the information had landed somewhere deep and mattered. Piece by piece, across a long and one-sided conversation, Mark began to understand something no report had captured. The Hulk was not rampaging. He was searching. Every mile he had crossed, every valley, every ridgeline, he had been looking for something. Mark asked him who he was. The answer came in fragments, in a voice like a landslide learning words. Banner, death, doors that opened. Green doors, always coming back, always. The Hulk spoke of a man he carried inside himself, of a place he could not return to, of a world that had tried to bury him so many times that burial had lost its meaning. Mark did not understand most of it, but he understood the shape of it, the way you understand a song in a language you do not speak. Loneliness. The monster was lonely. They sat together as the light changed, the young hero and the impossible creature, and an unlikely thing began to grow between them. Mark saw a being that wanted, more than anything, to be left alone, and could not control what happened when the world refused. The Hulk saw something rarer. He saw someone young enough to still believe strength existed to protect people. It reminded him of things he did not like to remember. Peace, as always, was temporary. They came out of the sun without warning, 3 Viltrumite scouts, fast and gray and utterly professional. The Empire had heard. The Empire had sent observers, and the observers had decided that observation was beneath them. The first strike hit the Hulk like a comet and drove him through a hillside. Mark shouted for them to stop. He moved to intercept, and a scout backhanded him out of the sky like a nuisance. That was a mistake. The Hulk saw the boy fall, and something in his chest went past anger into a country with no name. The fight spilled down out of the foothills and into the evacuated settlement, except it had not been fully evacuated. In the chaos of collapsing buildings and screaming shockwaves, the Hulk saw them, a family, trapped beneath the fallen wall of a store, the dust still rising, the scouts still circling above like vultures that had forgotten the point of the fight. The Hulk stopped fighting. In the middle of a war he was winning, with enemies diving at him from the sky. The most feared creature on 2 Earths turned his back on the battle, knelt in the wreckage, and lifted a slab of broken masonry, the size of a bus, off a group of strangers. He held it there, taking hits meant for them, shielding them with his body while Mark dragged them clear. When a building groaned and began to fall toward the street, the Hulk caught it. He simply caught it, and held 1,000 tons of death over the heads of running children until the street was empty. The scouts, to their credit, recognized a losing proposition when it picked up a building. They withdrew to report what they had seen, and what they had seen would trouble the Empire's strategists far more than the strength. Mark stood in the settling dust, looking at the giants silhouetted against the fires, holding up the sky so that frightened people could escape beneath it, and he understood the truth of it completely. That night he stood in Cecil's office and said the words plainly. He is not the threat. Cecil, who had spent his career being right about things like this, studied the boy for a long moment. "Then why," he asked quietly, "does every threat in the universe seem so interested in him?" Mark had no answer, but the question followed him home, and it would not let him sleep, because he had started asking questions of his own about the night the sky tore open, and the answers were beginning to suggest something no one wanted to consider. The rupture that brought the Hulk here had not behaved like an accident. Accidents do not aim. Someone or something may have brought him to this world on purpose. Cecil Stedman did not believe in the supernatural. He believed in threats, responses, and budgets. But the data sitting on his desk was beginning to strain all three. The dimensional residue surrounding the Hulk refused to behave. Every instrument pointed at it returned readings that contradicted the last. Energy levels rose when nothing touched them. The signature drifted slowly, almost imperceptibly, as though it were not radiation at all, but something with a pulse. One of his analysts, pale and sleepless, finally said the thing no one wanted to say in a government facility. "Sir, it behaves like it is alive," and it was connected to him. Wherever the Hulk went, the residue thickened, like smoke drawn toward a fire that had not finished burning. The tear that brought him here had never fully closed. It had only faded, the way a wound fades while the thing that made it is still inside. Meanwhile, out in the wilderness, the Hulk had begun to dream. They were not memories. He knew his memories, every ugly one, and these were not his. They came when he slept, and they did not leave when he woke. Vision, endless versions of himself stretching across an infinite dark. A Hulk dying on a world of ash. A Hulk kneeling on a throne of bones. A Hulk standing victorious over 1 billion graves, smiling, and that one was the worst, because the smile was not his. In every vision the same green light burned beneath his skin, and in every vision something waited behind it, vast and patient, watching him through his own eyes. He was beginning to understand what the scientists would have told him if he had let them close enough to speak. His immortality was not biology. It never had been. There was something behind the green door, something that opened it every time he died and pushed him back through, and it was not a mechanism. It was a will. The narration of his life had always been simple. Hulk smash. Hulk survive. But beneath the anger there had always been a secret, and the secret was this. He did not come back because his body refused to die. He came back because something refused to let him. Cecil reached the same conclusion from the other direction, and it terrified him more than any punch ever could. If the Hulk's immortality came from outside conventional biology, from outside this universe entirely, then Viltrumite's strength was not merely insufficient. It was irrelevant. You cannot kill a puppet by breaking its strings, when the hand that holds them is somewhere you cannot reach. Nolan, meanwhile, had problems closer to home. Word of the Green Giant had traveled up the Empire's chain of command, and the Empire's response was exactly what he had predicted. They did not want to understand the creature. Understanding was for things you could not dominate. The Empire wanted the Hulk studied, caged, or erased, and it had stopped asking his opinion on the matter. The strike team arrived without warning and without witnesses. 5 Viltrumites, veterans of planetary conquests, armed this time with more than fists. They had studied the footage. They knew what pain did to the creature, so they brought restraint fields, gravity wells, technology built to hold beings that punches could not. They found the Hulk in the high country, and they did not make Nolan's mistake of arriving with pride. They arrived with a plan. It was not enough, but it was close. For the first time since falling into this world, the Hulk was overwhelmed. The gravity well crushed him to the earth while the others struck in perfect rotation, never giving him the half-second of focus his rage required to build. They were not trying to beat him. They were trying to erase him faster than he could become. It was methodical. It was merciless. It worked. Mark arrived too late to do anything but watch. He watched from the ridgeline, held back by the sheer violence of it, as the strike team unmade the strongest creature he had ever known. When it was over, what lay in the crater was not a body anymore. The Viltrumites hovered above it, confirming the kill, and one of them said something in their own language that needed no translation. It is done. The ground began to shake. It started as a tremor, then a rhythm, then a sound that rolled across the mountains like the heartbeat of the world itself. Boom. In the crater, green light seeped up through the ruin of flesh. Boom. The body reformed. Not slowly, not with effort, with inevitability. Bone wove itself from light. Muscle followed. The strike team watched their perfect execution undo itself in seconds, and for the first time in their long lives of conquest, 5 Viltrumite veterans understood what their prey had been trying to tell every enemy it ever faced. Boom! The Hulk rose, and his eyes were not simply angry. They were illuminated from within, as though something behind them had leaned closer to look through. And the truth of the chapter settled over the battlefield like snow. They had not killed the Hulk. They had only made him angry enough to become something worse. The strike team broke. not from wounds, from comprehension. They fell back toward the sky, carrying a report no commander in the Empire would want to read. The creature cannot be held, cannot be erased, and grows worse with every attempt. But empires do not survive 1,000 generations by accepting defeat from a single being. In the dark council chambers of Viltrum, the decision was already being made, cold and final. If the Hulk cannot be killed, then he must be broken. And to break him, they would not send a team. They would send a war. The sky filled with them. They came through the clouds in formation, dozens of Viltrumite warriors in gray and white, descending over the ocean like a judgment. The Empire had weighed the reports, studied the impossible footage, and reached the only conclusion its nature permitted. The green creature was an existential anomaly. Existential anomalies were not negotiated with. They were eliminated before they became something the Empire could not file under victory. Earth became a battlefield in a single afternoon. Cecil activated everything. Every hero on every roster, every orbital weapon, every contingency he had spent a career building for a Viltrumite invasion he had hoped would never come. Cities emptied along evacuation routes rehearsed in secret for years. The Guardians deployed to coastal defense lines. Mark stood with them, jaw set, watching the horizon fill with enemies. And the Hulk was gone. Nobody knew where. He had vanished after the strike team fell back, disappeared into the wilderness as completely as he had once disappeared from the crater. Cecil's satellites could not find him. Nolan, who knew the creature's habits better than anyone, said nothing, but privately he suspected the truth. The Hulk had not fled. The Hulk was deciding whether this world, which had pointed weapons at him from the first hour, was worth the effort of saving. The Viltrumites did not wait for him to decide. They began with the cities, and it was not strategy. It was bait. The Empire had read the same reports Mark had written. They knew what the creature did when civilians were trapped beneath falling buildings, so they made buildings fall. The first arcology came down at dawn, and the screaming carried for miles, and that was when the ground began to shake in a rhythm the whole world had learned to recognize. He came out of the wilderness like weather. He crossed 100 miles in minutes, and when he hit the invasion force, he hit it like the ocean hitting a seawall. The battle that followed was the largest this Earth had ever survived, and it did not feel like surviving while it was happening. Each fight had its own character. One Viltrumite used speed, blurring around the Hulk in a storm of strikes, and the Hulk learned the rhythm of the blur and simply clapped his hands together, and the shockwave ended the storm. Another met him strength for strength, a brawler from a conquest dynasty, and the two of them demolished a waterfront district trading blows until the Hulk put him through a docked aircraft carrier. A third tried the oldest Viltrumite solution and dragged the green giant skyward, up past the clouds toward the killing cold of space. He made it as far as the stratosphere before the Hulk twisted, seized him, and drove them both back down like a falling hammer, and the crater they made was visible from orbit. They kept hurting him. He kept returning. And every time he returned, the math of the battlefield changed, because the creature that got up was always stronger than the one that had fallen. But victory had a price, and the price was the battlefield itself. Every punch he threw collapsed something. Every landing sent shockwaves through streets that still held stragglers, shelters, hospitals. The Hulk was winning, and the winning was demolishing the very ground he was defending. Mark saw it from the air and felt something cold settle in his stomach. At this rate, the Hulk would save the Earth, and there would be no Earth left to save. This was the conflict at the heart of it, and there was no clean way through. How do you stop a monster without becoming afraid of the hero inside it? How do you ask the only weapon that works to please stop working? Nolan confronted him in the ruins of a city plaza, in the brief eye of the storm. He did not attack. That alone told the Hulk how serious this was. The most proud being on the planet landed in front of the creature he had once tried to execute, and he talked. He told him the truth. The Empire would not stop. There were more warriors coming, and behind them more, an empire's worth. And the Hulk, unkillable, unstoppable, would meet every wave, and every wave would break against him, and every breaking would cost the Earth another city. Nolan had done the calculation. The creature would survive the war. Nothing else would. If you keep fighting, Nolan said, the way you fight, the Earth dies around you. You will stand alone on a graveyard and call it victory, because you cannot die, and everything you protect can. The Hulk looked around. He saw the burning skyline. He saw Mark, bloodied, pulling survivors from rubble. He saw a small crowd of civilians staring at him from a shelter entrance, and he knew that look. He had worn that look on the faces of strangers across 2 universes now, terror and hope sharing the same eyes. They were afraid of him. They were counting on him. Both at once, forever, the terms of his existence. And for a moment, in the middle of a war, the Hulk stopped. The battlefield held its breath. Then the sky tore open, not above one city, above the world. A second rupture, vast and wrong, blooming across the heavens in colors that had no business existing, and the light that poured through it was green, the same green that burned beneath the Hulk's skin, the same green as the door in his dreams. Nolan looked up, and Nolan, who had lived for millennia, who had stood at the head of conquering fleets, went pale, because he recognized what was coming through. Not the shape of it. Nothing had a shape like that, but the nature of it. The Empire had legends older than its cities about things that lived in the dark between realities, things that fed, things that wore the laws of physics like loose clothing. The Viltrumites had thought the Hulk was the disaster. Every warrior in that sky had come to erase what they believed was the worst thing this universe had to offer. They were wrong. The Hulk had not arrived in this world by accident, and he had not been exploring. He had been running. And now the thing he was running from had found the door his immortality had left open, and it was stepping through, and the whole sky came with it. What came through the rupture did not descend. It unfolded. It had no body that stayed the same from one moment to the next. It was a vastness wearing the suggestion of a shape, a darkness threaded through with that familiar green fire, and where its edges touched the sky began to forget its own rules. Clouds bent toward it. Light curved. The battlefield below fell silent, heroes and Viltrumites alike staring upward, because nothing in either of their worlds had prepared them for this. The entity was connected to the force behind the Hulk's immortality. It had always been connected. And standing in the ruins of the plaza, staring up at the thing that had followed him across the space between universes, the Hulk finally understood the whole of it, the way you understand a trap only after the door has closed. The dimensional collision that brought him here had never been an accident. His immortality was an anchor, a thread of unbreakable green tied to the deepest dark, and every time he died and came back, the thread pulled tighter. Every death had been a tug on the line. Every resurrection a knock on a door from the wrong side. The entity had not chased him through the rupture. It had climbed him, death by death, the way a climber ascends a rope, and it did not come to kill him. Killing him was the one thing in all creation that could not be done. It came to use him. The infection began immediately. Reality around the rupture started to rot in place. Gravity stuttered, so that rubble drifted upward in one street and fell like artillery in the next. The light turned the color of deep water. Dead things in the ruins, birds, insects, things better not examined, twitched and rose and moved with a single shared purpose. Energy went insane, and the heroes who wielded it found their own powers turning unreliable in their hands. Even the Viltrumites fell back. That, more than anything, told the watching world what it was facing. The proudest warriors in the universe, beings who had never once withdrawn from anything, withdrew. In his command center, surrounded by screens showing a sky that was dying by inches, Cecil arrived at the truth with the quiet of a man reading his own diagnosis. The Viltrumites were never the final enemy. They were simply the strongest beings available when the real one arrived. All their strength, all their empire, and the best they could be was a wall. The Hulk walked toward the entity alone. It spoke to him without sound, from the inside, in a voice like the dark between stars learning tenderness. It had been inside his head across 1,000 deaths. It knew him the way a jailer knows a prisoner, and it knew exactly what to offer. Peace, it said. No more banner fighting you for the wheel. No more humans pointing their weapons. No more fear in the eyes of everyone you save. No more waking in rubble. No more rising. No more fighting. Let me in, wear me, and I will give you the one thing you have wanted since the first bomb turned you into me. Rest. And the terrible thing, the thing that would haunt Mark's retelling of this day, was how close it came. The Hulk stood in the shadow of the unmaking of the sky, and he was so tired. Tired in a way no Viltrumite blow could ever reach. Tired across years and worlds and deaths beyond counting. Every world feared him. Every world broke against him. Every friend eventually looked at him the way the family in the settlement had looked at him, terror and hope sharing the same eyes. The entity was not offering him a lie. That was what made it a weapon. It was offering him the truth with the price folded neatly inside. The Hulk almost said yes. Then Mark arrived. He was bleeding. His suit was torn. He could barely stay in the air, and he put himself between the cosmic end of everything and the green giant, which was either the bravest or the stupidest thing anyone did that day. And he talked. He did not talk about destiny or power. He talked about the family under the slab of masonry. The children who had run beneath the building the Hulk held over their heads. The people in the shelter entrance who were afraid of him and counting on him at the same time. And who would, he said, tell the story of the giant who caught the falling sky until their grandchildren were old. "You think they only fear you," Mark said. "They fear you and they need you, and they are starting finally to understand you. That is not a curse. That is the whole job." And the Hulk looked down at the boy, and something settled in him, the way a great river settles into its course. He would never escape what he was. The green door would never lock. Death would never keep him. That was not a choice, and never had been. But there was one thing that had always been a choice, and he had made it in the settlement without knowing, and he made it now with his eyes open. He could not choose whether to be the Hulk. He could choose what the Hulk was for. He turned back to the entity, and the entity, sensing the change, moved first. It poured toward him like a tide of dark, to take what it had crossed creation to claim, to hollow him out and wear his immortality like a crown. The Hulk caught it. He caught it the way he had caught the falling building, the way he caught everything the universe ever dropped on the innocent, with both hands and his whole body and his absolute refusal to move. And for the first time since he fell through the wound in the sky, the Immortal Hulk was not fighting because he was angry. He was fighting because he chose to protect someone else. But holding it was not defeating it. And he understood that too, in the same instinctive way he understood everything about fighting. The entity was of the dark between worlds, and no blow struck in this world could end it. There was only one way. The anchor had to go back through the door and drag the climber with it, and the door had to close behind them both. The rupture still burned above the battlefield, open, waiting. And there was one problem with the whole plan, the kind of problem that had defined his entire existence. Someone had to carry the thing through, and whoever went through that door was not coming back. The strangest army in the history of any world assembled beneath a dying sky. Heroes and Viltrumites side by side without a word of negotiation between them. There was no time for treaties, and no need. The entity was unmaking the sky above them all, and extinction is a diplomat that never loses an argument. The Guardians formed evacuation corridors. The Viltrumite warriors, the same warriors who had come to this world to erase the green giant, took up positions around the rupture's edge because their commander ordered it, and because there was nothing else left to do. Cecil's voice ran through every channel, cold and precise, coordinating the defense of a planet that had spent the entire story one bad hour from annihilation. Mark attacked from above, striking at the entity's outer manifestations, the dead things and twisted knots of physics it was spreading across the city like roots. Nolan led the Viltrumites in wave after wave, buying ground by the city block and paying for it in blood. They were not fighting to win anymore. They were fighting for time. Everyone on that battlefield understood, without being told, that the battle would not be decided by them. It would be decided by the creature walking alone through the center of the war, straight toward the rupture, carrying the attention of the entity like a planet carries its gravity. The entity met him with everything. It turned the battlefield against him, the very ground, the air, the light. It showed him his visions made real, the dying worlds, the thrones of bone, the Hulk who smiled. It struck at the army around him, and a Viltrumite fell burning from the sky, and then another. Mark dove through a storm of corrupted energy and took a blow meant for a shelter full of evacuees, and he hit the ground hard and did not get up quickly. Nolan drove into the entity's mass and was hurled back through half a mile of city, and rose slowly, and did not rise a second time without help. The strongest beings in two universes were losing, and everyone could see it. Brute force, the Empire's answer to 10,000 years of questions, had finally met the question it could not answer, and in the center of it all, the Hulk began to change. His rage had always been his engine, and the engine had never once been fully opened, because there had never been a need, and there had always been a fear. Now there was both. His muscles swelled beyond anything the battlefield had seen. Green fire moved beneath his skin like sunlight through deep water. The air bent around him. The entity itself seemed to recoil, for one instant, from what was waking up. And here was the miracle, the thing Mark would tell people afterward when they asked how the world survived. The Hulk did not lose control. At the very summit of his rage, at the place where he had always been a landslide, a storm, an act of God, he remembered. The boy who sat with him by the river, the family under the masonry, the shelter full of frightened, hopeful eyes. He remembered why he fights, and the rage, the infinite, bottomless rage, did what it had never done before. It focused. All of it. Every death, every burial, every door, every rising gathered into a single direction like light through a lens. The Hulk seized the entity and began to climb. Up through the ruined sky, through the burning green wound between worlds, dragging the vast dark thing with him by main strength and absolute refusal. The entity raged and unmade the air around them, and it did not matter. Because you cannot frighten something that has died 1,000 times, and you cannot break something that breaking only makes stronger. Together they passed through the rupture, into the space between universes, and the whole battlefield below saw the sky swallow them both. Inside there was no space, there was no time. There was only the dark between realities, and the Hulk saw it all at once, the way the entity had always seen it. Countless worlds strung like beads in the black, and in every one of them there was suffering, and in every one of them there was a version of himself. He saw Hulks dying and Hulks triumphant and Hulks kneeling on thrones of bone. And in every world, in every single one, sooner or later, the same thing happened. He rose. The entity wrapped around him and spoke one last time, and its voice was almost gentle. "Look at it," it said. "All of it, you see. Immortality is not a gift. It is a sentence. Every world will fear you, use you, bury you, and you will rise and rise and rise, and it will never end. Give yourself to me. Let it end." The Hulk looked at the infinite dark, at the infinite suffering, at the infinite versions of himself rising from infinite graves. And he answered the way he had always answered everything that truly mattered. Not with words, but with action. He tightened his grip. If he could not die, then he would stand where everyone else would fall. If the rising never ended, then let it mean something. He dragged the entity down toward the dimensional core, the collapsing heart of the wound between worlds, and the entity understood finally what it had caught, that the anchor it had climbed was not a rope, but a chain, and the chain was attached to something that had never once let go of anything. The core began to close, and the dark between stars filled with green fire. And the last thing the entity learned was the thing every enemy of the Hulk learns last. You cannot win. You can only delay him. On Earth, the rupture began to shrink. Mark, on his feet again, bleeding, staring upward, watched the wound in the sky fold inward on itself like an eye slowly closing. The green light dimmed. The corruption in the streets faltered and stilled and died. The dead things lay back down. Nolan landed beside him, battered past anything his son had ever seen, and watched the closing sky and said it quietly. "The way you say things you want to be wrong about. He is gone." Mark refused to believe it. He said so. He kept saying so, to Nolan, to Cecil, to anyone who would listen, long after it stopped being a strategy and became a prayer. The rupture closed to a point. The point flickered. Then it was gone, and the sky was only sky again, gray and wounded and ordinary and whole, and the silence that followed was the loudest sound in the history of the world. The Earth had survived, and the Hulk was nowhere to be found. The Earth healed the way Earths do, slowly and stubbornly, and with a great deal of noise. Cities rose from their rubble, one street at a time. The evacuation routes were walked in reverse, families carrying their lives back home past memorial walls already filling with names. The world told the story to itself, the way worlds always do, in classrooms and documentaries and 1,000 arguments about what really happened, and every version of the story had the same green giant at the center of it. Everything was different now, in ways large and small. The Guardians of the Globe were different. They had fought beside Viltrumites and been saved by a monster, and neither fact fit into the manuals. They trained harder and boasted less. The Viltrumites were different. An empire built on the certainty that strength answered everything had watched strength lose and watched something stranger than strength win. Their warriors did not speak of it. Their silence on the subject became its own kind of monument. Mark was different most of all. He had looked into the dark between worlds, however briefly, and he had learned the lesson the Hulk had spent 2 universes teaching. Strength was not the point. The choice was the point. In a classified archive behind 7 locked doors, Cecil Stedman kept a file. It was thin, given everything that had happened, because the most important facts in it could not be measured. The label on the cover read simply, Hulk, status unknown. Cecil updated it personally. He never marked it closed. Nolan, asked once what the creature had been, gave the longest answer anyone had ever heard from him. He said he had fought beings of every kind across more worlds than he could count, and understood every one of them eventually, because everything alive wants something simple. The Hulk, he admitted, was one of the few beings he had never truly understood. Then, after a pause, he corrected himself. Number, he understood him once. At the end, when the creature chose. Mark kept visiting the place where it all began, the valley. The crater, long since softened by grass and rain, a green bowl in the earth that hikers photographed without knowing what it was. He went there when the world got loud, which was often, and he sat where he had once sat beside a lonely giant, and he talked sometimes, because you never knew. Then, one night, he heard it, a rumble, deep and slow, rising through the ground like something the earth had been holding its breath about. Mark stood. The grass shivered. The old crater cracked open along its floor, and green light seeped up through the fissures, and a heartbeat rolled across the valley, patient as stone. Boom. A green hand emerged from the earth. Boom. The Hulk climbed out of the ground of a world that was not his, whole and unhurried, the way he had climbed out of 100 graves on 100 worlds. Alive. Again. Always. Mark smiled. He could not help it. But the Hulk was not the same. There was no rage in him now, no landslide gathering behind his eyes. He stood in the moonlight and looked at the valley, at the distant lights of the rebuilt city, at the sky that was only sky, whole and ordinary and defended. Then he looked at Mark and he spoke, in the voice like a landslide that had learned gentleness. Hulk, he said, home, and Mark understood. Of all the worlds and all the dark, the creature who could never die had chosen this one. Not the world that made him. The world that needed him. The world he had chosen to protect, and so the world he had chosen, the way you choose anything that matters, by standing in front of it and refusing to move. The Hulk walked toward the horizon, and the knight stepped back and let him pass, and if there is a lesson in all of it, it is the one carved into no memorial wall but written in every life he shielded. Strength is not measured by how many enemies you can destroy. Sometimes it is measured by how many times you can rise and still choose to protect the world that once feared you. He grew smaller against the enormous landscape, a green figure swallowed by distance, until he was only a shape, and then only a story. And far beyond the sky, in the cold halls where Viltrumite survivors gathered, they spoke of the green giant in voices their empire was not accustomed to hearing. They did not call him a hero. They did not call him a monster. They gave him another name, one that had crossed the dark ahead of him and would outlive every report ever filed. The Immortal. And for the first time in its long and conquering history, the Viltrumite Empire was afraid of something it could not kill. He entered this universe as an unknown monster. He remains in it as something far more dangerous to its enemies, and far more valuable to the people he chose to protect. Somewhere out there, beneath some quiet field, a heartbeat is still sounding. Patient, faithful, waiting, and it will rise.